Let's just have a brief discussion, if we could, about efficiency. Let's leave aside renewables for a second. Let's just focus on efficiency. Is it worth it to invest in efficiency? Do we get a big payback from moving that way? Is the short-term investment almost inevitably rewarded by a longer-term benefit to the individual, to the company, to the country? Dr. Poland, could you deal with that question?
Well, the short answer is yes. I mean, the efficiency gains, as I documented and discussed, are very straightforward. We're using known technologies. We aren't thinking about futuristic technologies. We know that we can deploy workers. A lot of it is construction jobs. We know that 600,000 or so construction jobs have been lost over the last year. We know we can start these things immediately. It's we don't have to engage in land purchases, designing projects for infrastructure and so forth. So the answer is a very straightforward yes.
Okay. Well, Dr. Thorning, what do you have to say to Poland?
I think energy efficiency is ultimately very desirable. The question is, how fast do we get it and who pays for it? The U.S. economy, if you look at the DOE data, is getting more energy efficient by about 1.7% every year. Each dollar of GDP is generated with less energy every year. So we're making good strides in that direction. The question is, what's the best way to accelerate it? And as I mentioned, if we could take a look at the U.S. federal tax code and, for example, smart meters, which communicate between the electricity company and the customer, are depreciated real slowly here in the U.S.
Good. Well, that's what I'm saying. Well, let's agree on that. Let's agree that we're going to work on it. We'll put together a package that you, Dr. Thorning, it's called the Poland-Thorning Plan to invest in energy efficiency all across the country, and we could do that, don't you think?
So, but the question is, how much taxpayer money goes into this?
Well, how much does the taxpayer save? As a consumer, how much? I mean, if you think of the taxpayer as a consumer, then I see that Mr. Hendricks, he looks at this $9 billion tax break that the oil and gas industry gets each year. Well, obviously, the same consumer is actually subsidizing the oil and gas industry as they're getting tipped upside down at the pump. So they're one and the same, right? The consumer and the taxpayer when it comes to this whole energy sector. So could you deal with that, Mr. Hendricks, in terms of the relationship that exists between the incentives that are given for one as opposed to the other, that is efficiency?
Well, that's an excellent point. It is something that we document in the report. I mentioned earlier the difference in household expenditures when a traditional stimulus is spent just to encourage consumption. 22% of that money flows out of the economy. If you invest in energy cost savings and in infrastructure, only 9% flows out of the economy. So that basically is money that stays within local communities. In addition, the sort of investments that we're talking about on improved transit spending, Dr. Thorning mentioned the smart grid. The economic benefits of improving our grid infrastructure are very, very substantial, and they cascade throughout the economy because they make the economy as a whole function more efficiently. I believe the Pacific Northwest Laboratories estimated the benefit at about $80 billion over 20 years of moving to a smart grid that has these kind of real-time pricing and abilities to manage and optimize for efficiency. Rand Corporation estimates that at about $100 billion. That's very, very substantial new investment. If you look at how transit spending cascades throughout a community, you're making job access easier for working families. You're saving money that consumers would otherwise be spending on oil imports. And you're improving quality of life overall. So you're creating opportunities for new economic development that are very substantial. And the efficiency of our economy, we use about twice as much energy for every unit of GDP as our closest direct economic competitors. That in itself is a competitive disadvantage that we need to address. This is a chance to do it in a way that's also going to create benefits and growth.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%, Mr. Hendricks. That's the model that we have to go to. Mr. Redmond, let me go over to renewables here for a second. Somebody told me that it takes 26 tons of steel to build one wind turbine. 26 tons of steel. Now, that seems like a lot of jobs here in the United States. That seems like a lot of new opportunities for our country. And Dr. Thorning doesn't think that wind is yet efficient enough as a competing source of electricity. But the cost is certainly plummeting, almost the same way that, the cost of, what we did when we got we had the policy wrong on cell phones, that going into 1993, we had analog, and we only had 2 companies doing it. And it was 50 cents a minute, and very few people had cell phones. But then in 1994, the committee that Mr. Inslee and I serve on, the Energy and Commerce Committee, I was the chairman of telecommunications, we moved over 200 megahertz of spectrum and didn't let the first 2 companies bid on it. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th company that bid in each market then went digital, and they lowered the price down to under 10 cents a minute, and now there are more cell phones than there are Americans, because you just changed them all. So if you predict the future by looking at today, you're going to have a very real problem. You have to have some confidence that this technology is going to come down and there'll be a transition period. And talk to us a little bit about that and how it impacts the steel workers and other blue-collar workers across the country.
Well, you're right. The numbers that we got is more like 28 million pounds of steel could go.
28 tons of steel.
28 tons of steel could go into the building, the construction of one windmill. And the 2 largest domestic steel companies in the United States, which is U.S. Steel and Mattel Steel, has been actively pursuing that market. And but the market do not exist here in the United States. We have had relationships with, I spoke in my report about Gamesa, which is a Spanish company, which this week is over in Canada because the Canadian government is very, very interested in this sort of technology. But the 2 largest steel producers here in the United States are tooled up. They're ready to go. The building trades throughout the United States is investing within their training centers in order to teach workers, and they have been doing educational courses to train dislocated workers in this sort of technology. So the infrastructure is there with the steel companies and the American workforce to capitalize and take advantage of this sort of thing.
So if we had a national renewable electricity standard, if we mandated that 15% of all electricity by 2020 had to come from renewables, what would that mean for the steel workers? What would that mean for other workers across the country?
Well, it would be huge, not just for steel workers, but with that sort of renewable standard. I mean, it would also have a boom in the construction industry. It would employ and generate the need and the capacity to train and employ thousands of electricians and people within the building trades. And the capability is there. The irony of this is that competing markets are coming to the realization of the necessity for us to go in this direction, and the disappointment to working families and to the American labor movement is this, that the U.S. government and the corporations in the United States, and the investment is not just there, and we haven't totally grasped upon this model, where we don't feel if we don't grasp behind it soon, we're going to be left behind in this sort of technology.
Thank you, Mr. Redmond. Dr. Poland, Dr. Thorning points to the Lieberman-Warner climate change bill as a good example of why legislation in this area of controlling global warming is way too costly and will kill the economy. How do you respond to that?